If we lived in a future utopia where we had an abundance of time and money and life itself could be prolonged indefinitely, how long until that went from fun to boring to unbearable? Today, we are going to explore the unbearable lightness of being in a sci-fi utopia through the works of John Varley, the heir to Robert Heinlein. And you can still enjoy today's discussion even if you've never previously encountered this author. Grab some moon boots and your favorite ominous central computer and let's go! I am rejoined today by Tim Sandefur, a favorite guest of the program. He's been on here twice. He came on in the prequels to Alienating the Audience to talk about the Cold War mindset of Captain Kirk versus the touchy-feely relativism of Captain Picard, and got into what I hope will be a prelude to our eventual fistfight over whether or not the undiscovered country is good. But a smart man and an insightful science fiction fan. Tim, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. Incidentally, I had, when we did that episode on Kirk and Picard, I received probably like the second or third most hate mail that the show had got.
Every time I've done a podcast about why Next Generation sucks so bad and why the original series is the only real Star Trek, it apparently generates a great deal of hate mail, all of which is deeply misguided. So.
Yeah. Well, I should say specifically, people were rankled about Undiscovered Country. Or actually, they weren't even mad at you. They were mad at me for not like dropping everything and fighting you. Like they wanted me to like reach through the phone line and throttle you, but I was like, yeah, that's for another time. We'll do that another time. Today, though, we're going to talk about John Varley, who's the author of Steel Beach, and I think you originally introduced him to me as Heinlein's heir.
Yes, he is generally viewed as one of the leading follow-ons to Robert Heinlein, along with Spider Robinson and a handful of others. But Varley was, even Isaac Asimov himself said that Varley was a young Heinlein, and the parallels are quite strong. I think Varley is better than Heinlein, which is perhaps a heinous thing to say, but Varley is by far my favorite writer of all time, so perhaps I'm blinded in some degree.
I like Heinlein better. I don't want to kick it off by fighting with you. I feel like we could get into we'll get into the pugilistic stuff later on. I feel like Heinlein has a more compact plot than Varley does. Varley's is much more kind of meandering in his writing style, and so I feel that Heinlein is just more punchy. That said, though, why do you like Varley more than you like Heinlein, and why did you suggest Steel Beach as a reading source?
I think Varley doesn't write. Heinlein wrote a lot of stuff. Some of it is just fantastic, and some of it is crap. And Varley, I think, has produced a much higher ratio of good quality to bad quality writing. And Steel Beach, I think, if you were to name a single novel of Varley's that is the best, it's Steel Beach. So just to give some background here, Varley came to prominence in the 1970s with a series of short stories that were kind of set all in the same universe called the Eight Worlds series. And he then wrote several novels, including a trilogy called the Gaia Trilogy, which is actually much more heavily influenced by Larry Niven. And they're my favorites of all of Varley's writings, but they kind of stand outside his usual sort of writing. Then he wrote a quadrilogy more recently, a 4-volume set that is his explicit homage to Robert Heinlein's juvenile novels. And then he's written a series of standalone novels. But Steel Beach was the first book that Varley had published after a lengthy hiatus, because he had gone to Hollywood to work as a screenwriter. In fact, he wrote a screenplay for Heinlein's Have Spacesuit Will Travel, which has never been produced. And then after almost a decade, he came back with this very long novel called Steel Beach, which is set on the moon in the about 200 years after the human race has been chased off of the Earth by an alien invasion, by aliens that we actually have never seen. Nobody knows anything about them. It's just that they destroyed human civilization, and so the human race lives now on the moon and on the other planets in the solar system, except for Jupiter, which of course we can't live on. But and the story, the main plot of the story is that human life is basically overseen by this sort of all-encompassing but benevolent central computer, which then starts having certain problems.
Yeah. And I'll say for our purposes today, I think we should handle this as kind of a book briefing, so that people that have not read the book yet, since there's a good chance that we're introducing a lot of listeners to it, won't have major spoilers when we talk about it. Like, I can think of a couple things we should leave out. And then also, I'm thinking there's lots of themes to explore here, to the point where I think people can enjoy the podcast episode without having necessarily read the book. I think they'll enjoy it more if they go read the book, but if not, there's plenty of stuff to play with in it. So that's the kind of the intro setup to it. There's other, I'll say that there's additional kind of fun bits to it that fill out that universe. For example, the protagonist lives in one of the Disneylands. We're to understand that in the lunar future that humanity has retreated to, and in this 8-world scenario, the moon is the most populous of the places human beings have fled to. And there's been some kind of hump where it was very difficult and pioneering right when we got there, but now it's this utopian wonderland where everything's free and cheap and abundant. And some of the people choose to live in like historical preserves that are run as separate autonomous Disneylands. There's Texas, for example, is where our protagonist lives.
Yeah, and you live in it like it's 19th century
Right.
Texas, so the technology is all 19th century Texan technology, except they cheat a lot and things like that, and that's a feature of all of Varley's 8 Worlds stories. One of his greatest short stories is called The Phantom of Kansas, which is set in the Kansas Disneyland, and the main character is an artist whose art form consists of creating storms with the weather control technology in the Disneyland that they all live in. And what you do is you go out at sunset and watch the storm that this person has created with these machines. And so Varley's incredibly inventive, and he comes up with these extremely vivid, totally believable ideas, just little jewels of ideas that he scatters throughout his stories. I mean, at one point in Steel Beach, for instance, one of the characters is a genetic scientist, and as a toy for his children, he makes miniature horses and cows and sheep so that his child can have a real life little miniature farm with little genetically engineered ants to look like human beings to be the farmers and stuff. And it's just delightful little ideas that he scatters throughout the stories, which I think is also very Heinlein. One technique that makes Heinlein such a great writer is his capacity to hint at a backstory or to hint at technology and make the reader sort of fill in the blanks on his own, which gives it a vividness and a reality that's, I think, far superior to writers like Asimov or other writers who feel it necessary to explain all the technology in detail as an omniscient narrator. And Varley takes Heinlein's route and really takes it to an extreme so that you really feel like you're in this universe.
Yeah, I agree. Heinlein definitely relies on, I don't know what we call it, like referential narrative, where rather than explaining something, he'll just say, like, that was back when we were allied with the skinnies, and then he'll move on, and you never really explain that, but you're like, okay, well, now I know that there's at least 3 races of aliens, and I can kind of infer the shape of these, but the fact that he never goes like, the skinnies are from Alpha Centauri B, and we allied with them for 42 years, it gives, I find that it always gives the narration a much grander sense, or not grander, it makes the universe seem very expansive, because it's
very real, because normal people don't do that. Normal people, when they're talking, they don't stop and say, "Oh, and by the way, during World War II, we were fighting the Nazis, and they were made up of the Germans who did, blah, blah." They just make a reference to during the war, and they go on.
Yeah,
and so by adopting that realism, it's a difficult technique to master. But Heinlein was one of the greatest at it, and Varley, I think, has really learned from him.
Well, I'll tell you the thing that really interested me about Steel Beach is that I came into it your suggestion through the Heinlein connection. And I kept going back to Viktor Frankl, who is not a science fiction writer in any capacity, but I felt like they were intertwined. So, like, the themes, I'm curious to see what you saw as the most prominent themes in the book, because there's a lot, and there's certainly a lot of overt Heinlein references, and there's a fair amount of socioeconomic ones as well. But the ones that struck me were, first of all, it's not. No one in this society is immortal in the sense that they can't be killed, but they're all post-mortal in the sense that aging has been cured. So you have an open-ended lifespan. You could be killed by an accident, you could be killed by an invasion, you could be murdered, but you're not going to be you're not going to succumb to age unless you have elected to do that. You're not going to succumb to disease unless you're going to do that. So as a result, the main character is like pretty much deciding whether to kill herself through much of the book. And it's more complicated than that because it gets into, sort of involvement with the major computer system. But there's also this sense of like, if life is open-ended and I'm not having meaning rendered to life through finality, then what meaning do I find in life? Which strikes me as very Viktor Frankl. Are you familiar with him at all? He's definitely...
I am not. I have not read him, no.
He's... Okay, so...
But I agree with you that I don't think it's giving too much weight to say that the central mystery in the book is that the main character keeps killing herself and then somehow or another finding herself alive again.
Right, yeah.
And so the story is the unfolding of the mystery of how that happens. And the theme of suicide is throughout the book used as a way of talking about what is the purpose of life and how do we give meaning to life and why do we – is it just day after day continuing your existence or is there something more?
Yeah, there's definitely that ennui and sort of existential angst/paralysis that's playing out. Viktor Frankl, who I would highly recommend, although he has nothing to do with science fiction, Viktor Frankl was in his day considered the third father of psychoanalysis, something like that. So you've got like Freudian psychoanalysis. You had Viktor Frankl operating at the same time, and he had what he called logotherapy. So his he wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychologist prior to World War II. He was Jewish. He was sent to a concentration camp, and the book is. It's going to sound flippant for me to say this, and I don't mean it to come off as glib, but he's not. The point of the book is not to describe how bad the concentration camp is. He's assuming you know that in the book, and so he doesn't really go out of his way to like. It's not like Eli Wiesel where he's driving home how terrible a concentration camp is. Rather, what he's explaining is basically like, this is why I didn't kill myself. This was a horrible situation. My wife died in another concentration camp while I was here. When I got out of the concentration camp, everybody I knew was dead. What kept me going? And basically, his central thesis is he thinks that the central facet of humanity, the big issue is a search for meaning. People are driven by a search for purpose, and that things like money and power are really ways of distracting ourselves from figuring out our purpose, and that the purpose is the really big driver. So when he was doing therapy post-war, one of the questions he would ask people, not to bait them, but when people were very depressed, he would go, well, why haven't you killed yourself? What's stopping you from doing that? And would get into trying to suss out from them some sort of meaning or purpose in their lives that justify their continued existence.
Well, it's funny you bring this up because my wife and I have just been, we're just about to finish it. We've been watching the 1989 miniseries War and Remembrance, which is based on the Herman Wouk long novel about World War II. And much of it takes place not only in a concentration camp, but in the same concentration camp that Viktor Frankl was interned in. I looked this up on Wikipedia the other day at Theresienstadt. And it talks about it, and the two of us have been watching this very intense. I mean, in my view, this miniseries is even more graphic and shocking than Schindler's List, and it aired on primetime television in the 80s. But we've been talking about why wouldn't you just end it all if you're experiencing this kind of horror? So I am intrigued by your description of the book.
Yeah, it's really it's well worth reading. I mean to read it every other year. I don't get around to reading it every other year, but that is as close to a religious tome as I have. And
Steel Beach doesn't really get as deep into something like as horrific as the Holocaust. No. It's more like you said, like ennui. It's like if we've solved all the relatively simple problems about scarcity and aging and things, then what? And the title comes from a passage in the book where the computer describes humanity as being like a fish that has climbed, through the history of evolution, has climbed out of the ocean and is now on the beach. In this case, it's a steel beach because they're living on the moon. And now what? What is the purpose of beyond that struggle? Yeah. And so the book is basically a meditation on what is it that makes humanity more than just, eating and drinking and sleeping and so forth, which I think is also a very Heinlein theme.
Right. I agree with you because it's very interesting in that it is kind of like, I don't know what to call it, like a full circle dystopia. in the sense of like it's not. They're for the majority of the book, they're not living in like a totalitarian Orwellian society. They're not living in a Huxleyan nightmare. They're living in a place that like is by our standards wonderfully cheap and abundant. I mean, you can like anybody can basically have whatever they want for the most part. I mean, people have work and that kind of thing. But in the same way that like electricity is effectively free in our day, it's things that we can't have now are effectively free then. But there is this kind of boredom that sets in because there is such abundance that there is no like really motivating factor. Like one of the things that I think is interesting in the book is. So again, he's very overt in his references to Robert Heinlein. There's a group of people called the Heinleiners. At one point, they attempted to make an intergalactic ship called the Robert A. Heinlein. And the idea was that, well, humanity got jettisoned from Earth. We are now on the moon. We might as well figure out how to go to Alpha Centauri and start, colonizing the galaxy. And it basically fell apart because the rest of the population was like, well, why don't we just use that money to, get better trampoline parks? And and have cheaper coffee and things like that. And so there was this kind of teleological goal that was posited, but that's been gone now. So it's just now like you're puttering around, and they're in that post-scarcity, post-struggle world. You're not afraid of war. You're not afraid of death. There's like all the fear has been removed, but at the same time, there is a kind of existential lack of purpose. And it got me thinking about the economics of immortality. Like he didn't really go into it, but let's say that you're going to live for 300 years. I think in the book, the oldest characters are 300 years old.
Right.
I'm thinking if you had an open-ended lifespan, you did not see a natural death period. You wouldn't really retire, would you? Like you wouldn't have that option unless you really hit it big and could like just take money out of it, take dividends out of an index fund. You'd basically I think you would go on like 5-year sabbaticals every so often. Like you'd work for 20 years and then you'd take 5 years off. But you'd go on a cruise for a prolonged period of time, but you would never actually reach a point where you're like, okay, not working anymore.
Yeah, and there's a character who essentially does that. I think the editor, Walter Editor, I think he does something along those lines. And not only is it they sort of come up with their own versions of scarcity. Like, for instance, the main character gets a stipend from the government for keeping up the tradition of handwriting.
Yeah.
So, remembering old skills is subsidized by the government. Why? Who knows, right? It's just like, well, we have this thing, and so we should keep it, and there's no particular purpose for it. And I think they are faced with that question. But I think the overall point that Varley aims at is the idea that life, that utopia is not desirable even if it's attainable. And incidentally, you mentioned Star Trek. I think that it shares that in common with the original Star Trek. I think not only is the original Star Trek a deeply anti-utopian show in that it constantly says there's no such thing as utopia, but it goes even further and says utopia is not even desirable because it takes away what is essential about humanity, which is struggling to overcome the odds and to explore and expand throughout the universe and so forth, which is really kind of, if you think about it, kind of a Nietzschean ideal that is perhaps contrary to my own view that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the ideal that we, if we lived in a agrarian utopia with all of our problems solved so that all we did was sit around with our families and listen to music, I'm not persuaded that would really take something out of humanity. But it's a very common theme in science fiction, and it's certainly, I think, a Heinlein theme and a Star Trek theme, and it is certainly the theme of this book. And
I think it goes way further back than science fiction. Like I think you're describing the Lotus Eaters out of the is it the Iliad or the Odyssey? I guess it would be the Odyssey. But the Lotus Eaters who are basically just numbing themselves with some kind of delightful hallucinogenic drug or heroin or something like that. But they're sitting around, lolling about, and Odysseus encounters them and is like, "This is terrible. You're doing nothing. You need to quit. Get off of the drug which minimizes your pain and experience the pain and get out and live life and do adventures and conquer things. There's a passage in the book that I highlighted from the central computer, who's one of the main characters in the book, kind of a sort of a troubled version of the computer in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Like, it is this sort of, massive intelligence, consciousness, but has issues that it is dealing with that become a plot point. But he says at one point, we've prolonged life to the point that we don't have a clear idea of when it might end, but have failed to provide anything new and interesting to do with the vast vista of years. And he goes on to say something to the effect of, we'll get to the point where the only jobs are artists and the only jobs are poets and painters and that kind of thing. And he expresses great skepticism that everybody is up to that everybody could inhabit a world in which just everybody's creative and doing things just because they feel like doing it. The boredom would be too intense for such a society to really flourish and for everybody to be psychologically stable within it.
Yeah, and he's also concerned, I think Varley is also concerned about the overdependence on these outside sources of protection leading to our own flabbiness and our own weakness as human beings. I mean, this is another common theme in science fiction, and it relates to what we were talking about a second ago about utopianism. I was thinking in WALL-E, in the film WALL-E, where everybody's fat and sits around in their recliners all day. And I suspect there's a certain degree of this that relates to Varley's sort of hippie roots. Varley was although he lived in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district in the 60s. One of his closest friends is David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And he has a quality about him that really appreciates self-reliance and hard individual work in craftsmanship, which is an element of the hippie movement that is sometimes forgotten about. The hippies were very much into home crafts and the traditional arts of things like, blacksmithing and crocheting and things like that, because they thought it was important to be able to do things off the grid, maybe not all the way off the grid, but to try and maintain the capacity for self-reliance away from mass production society. And I think Varley has a quality of that in his writing and in this book particularly. He says here, and this is from the same scene you were just reading from. This is the main character speaking to the computer. "You're forgetting," I told him, "that in the real world, 1 trillion fish die for every one that develops a beneficial mutation that allows it to move into a new environment." "I'm not forgetting it at all," the computer says. "That's my point. There aren't 1 trillion other fish to follow us if we fail to adapt. We are it. That's our disadvantage. Our strength is that we don't simply flop around and hope to get lucky. We're guided, at first by the survivors of the invasion who got us through the early years, and now by the overmind that they created." "You mean you?" He sketched a modest little bow, still sitting down. So the conversation between, this is like the central philosophical point of the novel, is this conversation between the main character and the computer, and they go over all of these themes about the purpose of life and self-reliance and stretching oneself. But I don't mean to suggest, as our conversation probably does, that this is some deep philosophical novel like Atlas Shrugged or something.
I would say this is much more of a romp than it is an exegesis.
Very adventurous novel with lots of exciting and shocking passages. Yeah. One of my favorites is when the main character is out on the surface of the moon in her spacesuit and she sees a butterfly go by, and it's just which is of course one of the keys to the mystery, and it's just so beautifully written. I just can't get over how much I love this book.
There's a couple of very strange moments where you're like, wait, what? And it does make you kind of do a double take and like kicks the mystery element into high gear. And there's a bunch of fun things in it. Like one of the characters of the book is like a kind of like a drunkard ne'er-do-well, like kind of a low-level criminal. She's sort of a black market gun runner, and she's also the Queen of England. Because England has been, like all other nation states, has been extinguished by, the invaders 200 years ago. So she at the beginning of the book is the Princess of Wales. Her dad, who I think is a plumber, is the King of England, because the title is now it's existent. They know exactly who the heir to the throne was when the moon moon, when Earth was destroyed, because I think the Prince of Wales happened to be on vacation on the moon, so they know exactly who it is. But now it's just a place. It's like I think we figured out that the would-be head of the Plantagenet dynasty is he's like a stockbroker that lives in Manitoba.
Right.
Like it's that kind of thing, and so she plays a role, but there's a kind of self-awareness of the ridiculousness of having that title. So it's in there, but she's much more of the character who's like, the slightly grizzled but fun drunk lady at the bar who's chain smoking. Like that's that character. It's not in any way, shape, or form a stentorian aristocrat.
And Varley is such an incredibly skilled writer that sometimes when you describe his books, it comes off sounding truly inane, because he's able to make such wild, crazy ideas plausible while you're reading the book. Not only plausible, but absolutely convincing. So you're reading it and you take it totally seriously while you're reading it because it is so vivid. But then when you try to explain to somebody, for instance, I mentioned the Gaia Trilogy, which is the 3-volume set that he published in the 1980s. The first volume is called Titan. The second one is called Wizard. And the third one, which is probably my favorite novel of all time, is Demon. And the premise is that there's this world orbiting Saturn that's shaped kind of like the space station from 2001. It's like a wheel-shaped space station, except it's not a space station. It's an actual world, and it's not just a world, but it's actually presided over by this god creature called Gaia. And the trilogy is the story of them overthrowing Gaia because she slowly goes insane and starts oppressing the people on this planet. So it's basically a revolutionary war against an insane god is the plot of this series, which sounds truly ridiculous, especially when you say in the third book she manifests herself in a 50-foot tall clone of Marilyn Monroe. Which sounds totally ridiculous, but when you read the book, I mean, it's so vivid that you're absolutely there, and it's just powerful and moving in every imaginable way.
Some of the things that I enjoyed playing with in the book, again, to go back to the concept of open-ended mortality, one of the things that I thought was really well played and well written was the Brenda character, who is Brenda in the book is the starry-eyed 17-year-old Angelou who is looking to become a journalist like Hildy, the protagonist. And I'll say, almost certainly, if Robert Heinlein were writing that book, she would have become a principal love interest very, very quickly because, there's the competent, highly competent, plucky protagonist in every Heinlein book. And then there's the hot girl who loves him and also just has very open sexual standards. It's just like, you know what?
Right.
I have no commitment whatsoever, and I just want to hop into bed with you. So that would have been the Brenda thing. Brenda would have come in, and there would have been a brief courtship, and then she would have become the sexual sidekick to the protagonist. The way that Varley writes the book is she's 17 and incredibly irritating to the protagonist. She's not irritating as she's written to us. To us, she's just, she's like basically an intern. She seems like she's, bright-eyed and wants to help out and everything. There's nothing, but to the protagonist, who is 100 years old, I think, a little over 100 years old,
right?
And I'll add to this: everyone lives in a hot body because you can modify your gender and your face as easily as you would get a haircut in this world. Like you can get surgery. It's walk-in surgery clinics that can make you a model. So if you're a 100-year-old living in the model of a 24 or living in the body of a 24-year-old model, and you're encountering a 17-year-old. There's not that Heinlein ooh, young flesh. There's not that element. It's just you're another hot person, except you're an idiot. Like you're a dumb hot person, and I am less interested in you, 17-year-old hot person, than I am in an 80-year-old hot person because that person's fun to talk to and smoking hot.
And when the difference between Varley and Heinlein kind of comes up in connection to Brenda, I think. So the Brenda character, you're right, that's what Heinlein would have done with Brenda, and Varley doesn't do that. Instead, we discover over the course of the novel that Brenda is actually a victim of child abuse.
Yeah.
And the character, and we learn the story behind that, and it's taken very seriously. And Varley has a quality of feminism about his writing. He won awards for the feminist science fiction clubs, I think it was, used to give him awards for his work, because he really never goes down the sort of sexist road that Heinlein often takes. Now, in his day, I'm sure Heinlein was not at all regarded as a sexist, but by today's standards, a lot of his stories kind of come off as flippant toward the concerns of women, and especially if you read something like Starship Troopers, which basically has no room for women at all in the book. And Varley never goes to anything like that extreme. On the contrary, in most of his books, the protagonists are women, and his female characters are strong, interesting, beautifully written, totally believable heroines, and who have normal weaknesses and strengths, and overcome obstacles. So Varley is really a great feminist writer, and he seasons his Heinlein qualities with a degree of seriousness that I think is lacking from a lot of Heinlein's work. So Heinlein, especially in his juveniles, they're very charming and gee whiz and exciting and beautiful, and they're a lot of fun, but there's a certain sweetness and humor to them that makes it difficult for you to take them seriously as profound in any way. And Varley, I don't think Varley ever does that. Maybe a little bit in that quadrilogy that I mentioned, the Thunder and Lightning series, the 4 books that are based on Heinlein's juveniles. But in Steel Beach and in the sequel to Steel Beach, which is called Golden Globe, there's a real deep seriousness to this book that I don't think Heinlein ever managed to reach. When Heinlein tried to be serious, he often came off as just preachy, and Varley doesn't do that at all. Golden Globe, in fact, is about an abused child who's confronting what happened to him by his father, and it's set in the same universe in the same time span as Steel Beach, and is almost as good. It's based actually on Shakespeare. It has 5 chapters that are based on the 5 sections of a Shakespeare tragedy. The main character is an actor who's working through his experiences in terms of the Shakespeare that he's read. So there's a degree of seriousness to Varley that I find lacking in a lot of Heinlein. I don't mean to denigrate Heinlein, but I just think that Heinlein has a certain levity that Varley is very careful to put in its right place.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, because I wouldn't say that Heinlein is unserious, but he definitely is leaning into levity in terms of the narrative timbre of his stories. Like, it's generally the darkest a character's mood ever gets is like, boy, that's a tough problem. Grab a wrench and let's go. Like, it's always there's no moment in the Heinlein universe where the protagonist ever has like I don't think we're going to make it. I am filled with despair. They're all very can-do characters. They're very plucky characters. Whereas Varley, it's certainly, I'd say it's glibly written, because it's a first-person narrative from the perspective of Hildy, and so and Hildy has a kind of a kind of a reminiscent, like, 1920s reporter, like, honey, if you believe that, like, kind of thing to it. Not to the point where it's saccharine or irritating, but there's definitely like a little bit of a witty flourish that the character speaks through. So that's persistent. It never gets into, like, Pat Conroy, the meaning and beauty of pain level. Like, it doesn't do that. But it does explore many of these, like, more mature themes about kind of, I think, what it is to exist and what it is to be a person. Whereas I think Heinlein was generally more concerned with how society operates and how your role as an individual works in regards to society.
That's very true, and actually, that's another important difference between Varley and Heinlein. And I think of this because I just recently read Starship Troopers for the first time, because I'd seen the movie, and I was aware that it was sort of a satire of the book. They are not the same thing, yeah. Of course, and it is a satire of the book, although I think it's a perfectly justified satire of the book. I think the criticism that the novel Starship Troopers is basically fascist, I think, has a lot of merit to it. And Varley never approaches that. There's never anything about, the relationship between the citizen and the state, and how, fighting is absolutely necessary to maintaining freedom and things like that. There's a little bit of that in Varley, because he takes that seriously. He takes seriously the idea that you have to fight for freedom, and he takes seriously, like, there's a character, Walter Editor, in this book says all free men are gun owners. There's a certain quality of that self-reliance does matter to Varley, but the militarism is very much not a part of Varley's writing. And as I said, I think he's got a little bit more of that hippie quality than Heinlein had, although nowhere near to the degree of something like Stranger in a Strange Land, which I think would be alien to Varley in many ways.
Yeah, so because Heinlein really enjoyed putting sex in stories, and he also really enjoyed playing with. He enjoyed playing with the concept of sexual mores very much, which Varley does as well. Because like Varley in the book,
very much.
the protagonist like switches genders about a third of the way in. And
well, the opening line of this novel is, "In 5 years, the penis will be obsolete," said the salesman.
Right. So, yeah. Well, which I think is already alluding to the boredom problem as well, because it's kind of the salesman's basically pitching it like, hey, once you've been having sex 80, 90 years, like you've figured out there's only X amount of positions. Aren't you kind of bored? Right. It's time that you change your genitals to like a fourth option. You know of the two, maybe the three, but did you know there's a fourth thing we've built? But Varley likes playing with the hippie element. I agree. The other thing that I find interesting about Varley's writing style is my suspicion is that because the Heinleiners and the Robert A. Heinlein are so prominently displayed in the latter half of the book. Like it's not like just like a wink of like, naming there's a city called the moon is a harsh mistress and everything. Like Heinlein is so prominently displayed. My suspicion is that he is probably very sympathetic or shares a lot of Robert Heinlein's views on politics and how society should be done. But what he does that I think was a really interesting tactic is he'll basically explain the very like kind of misanthropic anti-statist positions of Walter Editor or of Smith, the head of the Heinlein Society, and he'll portray them as sort of lovable curmudgeons with whom the protagonist disagrees. Be like, this crazy guy believes X, but it's kind of an interesting way of like the protagonist appears to think all of this stuff is crazy, but a decent amount of time is spent flushing out the crazy ideas of these noble characters that everybody thinks is kind of rough.
Yeah, it's grudging adoration for them. And I think that's probably true of Varley's attitude toward Heinlein in general. Varley, so some years ago, Varley actually won the Prometheus Award for Libertarian Science Fiction for the novel Golden Globe, which is the sequel to this book. And he mentioned on his website, this is kind of weird to me because I'm not a libertarian. Yeah. And he's not. He's a welfare state liberal of the 60s variety and so forth. But he finds a lot to admire about libertarianism. And on a social level, I think he is himself a libertarian. It's just the economics he's not on board. But you see that tension, which I think really animates, as you said, it really animates the novel, this sort of Varley loves Heinlein, but also resists him in some important ways. And I feel it necessary to emphasize this is by no means like copying Heinlein or plagiarizing him or anything like that. This book stands on its own. It's just heavily influenced by and openly admits it's influenced by Heinlein is all. Yeah,
I think that's true. Were there any themes in the book that like for me, Man's Search for Meaning was a not heavily stated but nonetheless deep recurrent theme of the book. The effects of abundance and the effects of effective immortality were themes that came to me in the book. Was there any themes that you found that he was playing with or philosophical constructs that he was playing with that struck you?
Well, I think they yes, but they all relate to those general themes in the sense like what we see Hildy feeling a sense of something missing in life. And she doesn't quite know what it is. And then she goes through several really shattering experiences, including witnessing the murder of somebody that she really admires very deeply. And it really rocks her to her core. And what she finds to fill that emptiness is a sense of purpose that she finds towards the end of the book that allows her then to feel at peace with herself. And I think that's kind of, we see that idea manifested in various ways throughout the book. And there are just individual episodes where that comes up that are so vividly done, like the scene when she burns down the cabin in Texas. And I read this book at a time for the first time right when I was in high school, at a time when, the ideas of what is life about and what gives our lives purpose was first and foremost in my mind. I was 16 or 17 years old. And then I read it again when I got out of college, when I was going through a very difficult time in my life. And I thought the sympathy and power with which Varley addresses these questions and the feelings of hopelessness, and then what it means to discover hope. I just think they're very eloquently put in the novel. The reason I say it's his single best novel is because he was written a lot of book series,
right.
The Gaia Trilogy and the Quadrilogy and things like that. And so if you're only going to read a single book of his, this is the one I recommend. But I love virtually everything he's ever written. He did an anthology of short stories about 10 years ago or so called the John Varley Reader that contains his really great short stories. And, there's a couple in there that I would say are not great. Probably his most famous story, actually, which is called The Persistence of Vision. He won the Hugo and the Nebula Award for it. I think is probably his worst story. But it's deeply hippie. I mentioned the hippie influence. It's got this romanticism about primitive life that I find revolting. Instead, I think it's in some ways, I see it as the opposite of Steel Beach in that it is pro-utopian, whereas Steel Beach is really very anti-utopian.
Well, I want to go back to earlier in our talk, Tim. You said that you did not think, or you were skeptical of the claim that a post-abundant society would be challenging. That, like, if we were all if we had nothing compelling us to work, rather we were just picking whatever we wanted to do, and it was just for kicks, that would be a preferable state. Unpack that for me, because I don't think I agree. I think, like, it's a weird thing where obviously I want everybody to be prosperous and happy and free and all of those different things, of course. However, it seems to me that the struggle is a big part of human existence, and a kind of I think people tend to find meaning in group struggles, which is why, like, weirdly, like when you're in a war situation, a lot of the time mental health goes up because people are now a part of a group, and they're part of they're not. I'm not just Brad the bricklayer who doesn't really enjoy his life in London. I'm in a bomb shelter with my neighbors, and I have to get up for Britain because we're fighting the Germans, and I'm now a vital part of this thing. Like, that seems to be a big element of purpose for people.
Totally agree. And I do think people do need purpose, and they find purpose in setting challenges or taking on challenges. And of course, the big challenges are the biggest examples, things like wartime or the coronavirus crisis that we're going through and now, all these sorts of things, which, by the way, I think there's an eerie parallel to that in Steel Beach with the incident of the big glitch that comes about halfway through the novel. But what I mean to say is, I think that we, in talking about that, people tend then to go a little too far and say, well, then our purpose has to be something grand. It has to be something in the terms of, a war or a worldwide pestilence or something like that. And I don't think so. I think we can find purpose and satisfying purpose in what Deirdre McCloskey calls the bourgeois virtues. And I think the Jeffersonian image of the small-scale yeoman farmer who is happy in his house with his family, growing his own food, I think that can be just as satisfying and just as fulfilling and just as meaningful. And it has the upside that it doesn't involve war. So I don't disagree that we need challenge in our lives and that a true utopia would be hell. But I just think that anti-utopians tend to fall into sort of the Nietzschean mold of saying, well, then man must struggle and face death in order to find meaning in his life. And I don't think that's at all right. I think, the challenge of building a building or writing a novel or something can be just as meaningful, and in fact more so, because they're peaceful and productive enterprises.
My first job out of college was working on a ranch in Logan County, Oklahoma. And my primary job was building, I wasn't roping cattle and that kind of thing. Sadly, I did not rise to that level of rank in the ranch hierarchy. My primary job was building a loafing shed for cattle to hang out in during inclement weather, and to restore fences that had been knocked out by flooding. And it was a strange thing where at the end of the day, like, it was not intellectually exhilarating work by any stretch, but at the end of the day, I could look and go, I built that. That is a thing that I built with my hands. I know exactly what I did today. I know what the fruit of my labors were, and there was a great sense of satisfaction to it.
Definitely. The movie Office Space?
Yeah.
at the end of Office Space, they all get jobs on the construction line, and they're at the very last scene, they're leaning against their shoulders, and they're so happy that they're out there doing something that they feel is productive and matters to them. And that's a great ending, and it's a great story. I also think, though, there are people who are very happy and very productive in producing TPS reports. And if it's something that's productive and it gives them a sense of fulfillment, I don't think we should necessarily look down on that.
Sure. No, I don't mean to misalign anybody's career path if it's bringing them joy. My only point was that there seems to be like you brought up construction workers. I think construction workers routinely report the most job satisfaction of vocations, largely because they're able to see exactly what they did. I think everything I do is ephemeral. There's nothing in my life right now that there's a physical thing you could point to. I mean, you and I are talking heads on the internet. We're disembodied ghosts to the people listening to this, and I like that. I'm fine with all that. I could see though, like if you don't like doing TPS reports, or if you're doing if you're a cog in you're doing rote tasks and you're a cog and you can't really see the end pursuit of it, I think it's more difficult for you to get through that kind of thing. Like I used to do data entry work, and it was just that was far more challenging for me to get through a day of doing data entry, even though I could listen to podcasts and be reasonably intellectually stimulated, than it was working on the ranch. Again, that's also like I'm an extreme extrovert, so I think it was just the fact that I was sitting by myself all day that made me miserable. And like other people are wired different. I have friends that do data entry that love it because they can do podcasts and things like that.
Oh, and it's funny because this I think relates to one of the most moving scenes in Steel Beach, which is the scene that I mentioned earlier about burning the cabin down. That in that passage, Hildy has worked so hard to build this thing, and it has created a sense she's not feeling the depression that she was feeling before. She's felt that sense of involvement in something that is difficult task, but once it's finished, that sense goes away. And there's that part when she's kneeling on the ground, she looks up and sees the deer, and she thinks to herself, it's the most beautiful thing she's ever seen in her life. And it's just the way it's written is so passionate and moving. And that, I think, expresses just what you're saying, that we need the sense of challenge, but it needs to be not just any challenge. It has to be a challenge that makes us feel like we've done something that's significant and beautiful and important in our lives. And it can be anything from, raising a child, to writing a poem, to growing a beautiful garden, to building a skyscraper. Yeah,
well put. One of my friends, young lady that I dated and probably should have married, ended up getting into the ASPCA, and she, her job is taking care of animals, and that's been her job for quite some time. And I'm like, that seems like a wonderfully fulfilling thing to do with your life, to go to sleep knowing that there are dogs that are happy and alive because of the things that you have done with your day. That seems like a great sense of meaning to have in that. Yeah. Out of curiosity, are you familiar with Sebastian Junger? Have you read anything by him?
Yes. Yes. In fact, I just did a podcast with some other friends about his book Tribe.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Which I quite hated. And,
really? You hated that?
And explained in depth in that podcast. So I'll refer to listeners to the Armstrong and Getty Book Club podcast I did about 2 months ago or so on that book. Now, the problem with the book, I thought, was that he's right enough that what he says that is right, the problem with that is that it's obvious. And then the part that's not obvious is just not true. So he emphasizes, like we talked about, that you need a sense of purpose, and he's right about that. But then he seems to take the next step to say that therefore, we need to live in a society that is obsessed with crises all the time, because it's during crises that we feel our sense of belonging. And I don't think that a sense of belonging with my fellow human beings is necessarily the same thing as a sense of purpose. In one particularly absurd passage of the book, he goes so far as to say that it's bad that we sleep in our own bedrooms, that we ought to engage in what he calls group sleeping because it gives us a sense of belonging and so forth. Well, I think this is a deeply romanticized vision of what life under harsh conditions is about. I agree that we need a sense of purpose, but he seems to commit the naturalistic fallacy, which is, the naturalistic fallacy is if you go out in the garden and you see that there's a bunch of weeds and dying plants, you assume, therefore, that's right, and that there should be weeds and dying plants in gardens. And he does that by saying, well, if you look at crisis situations, people feel a sense of purpose and belonging. Therefore, the best thing is to live in a society that's constantly feeling itself on the brink of crisis. And so he praises what it's like to live in wartime situations, or in Israel, which is constantly feeling that it's being threatened, and because everybody feels a sense of belonging. Well, no, I think peace and freedom and independence from my fellow human beings are extremely important values, especially the last thing. My ideal society is one where people leave me the hell alone. I don't want to feel a sense of belonging with 99.999% of the human race. I would like them to nod to me while I'm walking to the mailbox and have no other interactions with me under almost all circumstances. And I see nothing wrong with that. So I object to Younger in that respect.
Whereas on my end, my ideal society would be like a steampunk Norman Rockwell painting. That would be the world I want to live in. I would live in this extremely neighborly, like, oh, hey, I saw the light in your house. I thought I'd come over for coffee. Great, Ted, come on in. Like, that's very much the universe I want to live in. But I think my guess is you're more of a...
you can live in the Kansas Disneyland,
yes,
and I'll live in the Texas Disneyland.
Exactly. I interviewed Sebastian Junger on my program here a year and a half ago or so. I do not believe he would say that we should be fabricating emergencies, nor that the ideal state would be one of constant vigilance due to actual existential threat.
I agree. He explicitly says that he's not saying that, and yet when you read his book, he is in fact saying that.
Well, I'll defer to him on that. However, I do think that's interesting. Like, I think because when you and I talked about the Twilight Zone on a prior episode of this, I enjoyed all the nostalgia of the Twilight Zone, and I'm like, oh, these like if we were, I was at Disneyland about a month ago, maybe 2-3 weeks before lockdown.
The real Disneyland.
I was in the real Disneyland, and it was funny that I was like, I could totally live in a bunch of these different nodules. Like, I would fit in very well on Main Street, USA. I'd get my barbershop quartet suit, and I'd just be strutting around singing and like eating ice cream with people.
Oh man, be careful what you wish for. You're like that. You're like that guy in that Twilight Zone episode who thinks he's in heaven and then it turns out he's in hell.
I think you're more the guy with his wife and a cat in a cabin. I think you're you're ideally living in the wilderness and venturing into society only when it suits you. But the default state. Tim, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I always enjoy having you on the program and enjoy speaking to you in general. Thank you for introducing me to a new and wonderful author. Where can people follow up with you, find your work, that kind of thing?
You can find my website at sandefur.typepad.com or just Google Timothy Sandefur. And Varley's website is varley.net, just his last name, VARLEY.net. And again, I recommend especially the Gaia Trilogy, Titan, Wizard, and Demon, and then this series, Steel Beach and Golden Globe. And then he did the 4-volume series that's based on Heinlein's Juveniles and a number of other standalone novels.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. Most weeks, Nick Sperduti, my friend and fellow comedian, and I come on the end of the program to tell you about some amazing world or planet that we have performed comedy on and tell you what it's like doing that there. Now, we haven't been able to do that the last few weeks because we're on lockdown, and
tell me about it.
Yeah, and so we've actually just been kind of giving you updates on what it's like being in lockdown with an apartment full of Wookiees and a droid and a Gungan. And it got a little intense last week because my then girlfriend Chewbacca and I broke up, and she really didn't handle it well, and so
you both and mostly you shattered every dish in this apartment. Like literally, we've got a couple of small like metal things that wouldn't break, but other than that, we're eating off paper dishes from here on out. And how hard is it to eat spaghetti off a paper dish? You know how hard it is? It's a lot.
Oh, I know.
It's some effort. And you should know because you've had to do it. And meatballs rolling everywhere.
You know, it was kind of a blur, but I'm pretty sure Chewbacca broke all those dishes. I think I was just standing there talking sense.
You were just swinging your arms wildly like a madman shouting.
I think we're saying the same thing. And so I'm going to just move on from that.
Yeah, all right,
and
fine.
The good news is that we're going to hopefully make it a little bit less tense in here because last episode, Nick suggested that we bring on our protocol droid, AJ-19, who speaks like 1,000 languages and knows all sorts of etiquette, and we think it'd be a good mediator between me and Chewbacca to, kind of just pave over some of this nasty business. And so we're going to bring on AJ again. He's been on previously.
Andrew, we actually couldn't get AJ-19. He's currently our dishwasher, so he's on that side of the line and can't come over here.
Wait, he's on Becca's side?
Yes, but not on purpose. We didn't really think out the lines when we drew them. We just wanted you both to be able to get to the bathroom.
Wait, does everybody else have to abide the lines?
Not necessarily.
But AJ
unless
does.
you want to pick sides. Yeah, but no, AJ's he's hooked into the plumbing right now.
Oh, really?
So he can't really move. Yeah, that's how dishwashers work.
Oh, well, yeah, good point. Yeah, my bad. I assumed he was just a mechanical man washing dishes by hand. He's actually a dishwasher.
Yeah, no, he became a dishwasher. It's an amazing addition, but once we got the new setup for him and the new updates, it's been great. Anyway, the point is, I asked around, and I asked Megan. She said definitely not. And then I asked most of the other Wookiees, except for obviously Chewbacca, but they all have kind of some mixed feelings right now about the situation. Right. Also being Wookiees and being so close with you and Bex. And then I asked the iguana, and he said no. Well, he just kind of shook his head.
That's everybody then.
Well, there's one person that was kind of really enthusiastic and really gung-ho. And, that pun not intended.
You're not talking about our Gungan, are you? Joe Blobe? Surely not.
So I thought maybe if we needed to fill space this week.
Nick, I don't want to be a dick here, but I don't think people will even be able to understand our Gungan. Like, I can barely understand our Gungan. Like, he's like, Misa thinks Yusa, like he has this cartoonish, sing-songy caricature voice, and I like.
Hey.
Oh God!
Oh boy!
Joe Blobe.
Hey, what are you guys doing over here?
We're recording a podcast, Joe Blobe.
Remember, this is what we talked about the podcast.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You guys, you always seem so excited about it. But
so
you never quite tell me when you're going to be around, when it's going on.
So all right, so listeners. For anybody new that is unfamiliar with our setup here, Nick has saved multiple life forms that have incurred a life debt to him. That's why there's 8 Wookiees living in this apartment. One of the creatures that Nick saved is a Gungan named Joe Blobe.
Hey, that's me. Hey.
Yeah, so slow down there, Slugger. So you're in an audio medium right now, so I'm going to ask you to speak real clearly. Remember that most of the audience doesn't know Gungans, isn't familiar with Gungans. So, just try and be as clear and just as clear as you can while you're talking.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Andrew. You're 100% right. The diction classes I was taking before this that you had suggested I take. They've obviously stopped during these times. So I apologize. Can you hear me clearly? Hope your day's going great. Have you guys noticed it's bright and shiny outside?
Yeah, I guess it's reasonably nice out there. Yeah,
it was raining earlier, but whatever.
So Joe Blobe, I know that we're in pretty tight, confined space here, but I really haven't spoken to you in about 6 weeks. I just haven't got around to it. What have you been doing to keep yourself occupied during quarantine?
Oh, at first, I got a little sad and introspective, so I was reading some books that were just around the house, some philosophy and things like that. But I thought I should really put my efforts into something positive, something that's really, really productive. So I've been talking with some friends back on Naboo at the Gungan embassy there, and we're trying to get some supplies to help everyone out over here on Earth with this whole mess.
I'm at level 15 of the dating game in Oculus Quest, so I've been doing stuff too.
That looks like so much fun. I really can't wait till you let me try it.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe that'll
be a while.
Yeah, it's yeah. Well, anyway, that sounds like you're occupying your time talking to fellow Gungans and stuff. Hey, can I ask you something, Joe Blobe?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So in your primitive Gungan culture, you have these life debts that these life debts that Nick saved you from drowning, and now you're indebted to him. Is it for is it for all of your life, Or is it like a prison sentence for us where it's like life, but we can get out on good behavior? Like when do you get to leave?
I guess it's until I can really repay it by saving him from some kind of imminent, mortal, life-threatening danger. If he did perish and I wasn't able to satisfy that debt, I would then have to, I suppose, take his place in his marriage.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to talk about that. I thought you were going to say take your own life, and I was going to say, no, don't do that. But I think that might be preferable.
I got to say,
like, taking place in my marriage.
Nick, fair is fair. Like, fair is fair. It sounds like if you die, Joe Blow really ought to take over, the spousal duties with Megan.
I couldn't agree less, and I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen, whether I have to kill him my damn self. It's something to think about for sure, right? So if and when that happens, if Nick dies, Joe Blow, it'd be good to know that you'll step in and wed the widow Sperduti. But if Nick, if you save Nick and you're released from the life debt, what are you gonna go back to Naboo and hang out in the swamp and trip on stuff? Like what would you do with your time?
Hey, whoa! I mean,
he trips over his leg and breaks something again.
That happened once, okay? That happened once, and you try and paint it like I'm some bumbling idiot or something, but
it's like we live with Dick Van Dyke with gills. At the beginning of that
Jerry
black and white
Lewis
show, he's
over
just falling over futons all the time.
This isn't one-ended, This isn't ideal for anybody involved.
What do you mean?
Yeah, you always seem so excited to be a part of our posse.
Look, I'm trying, okay? I'm trying really hard, you guys. But I'm stuck with you, okay?
Well,
and you guys, you argue all the time, and you go off on these fantastic adventures, but you just find some way to complain and just fuck things up so hard every time. I'm sorry.
Whoa! That is a lot of negativity right there.
Right.
You're right. I'm sorry. You're right. I apologize.
Who are you, Don Rickles of Naboo?
I just say that we're bound to each other. This isn't a one-way street there. We're all this together. You, me, the Wookiees, AJ-19, Megan.
I don't like how you said her name. I'll be honest. It's kind of getting on my nerves a little bit.
I'm sorry about blowing up earlier. The mortal debt will be paid when it's time for it to be paid. I think we really just gotta, have you guys ever gotten into Catan? I keep trying to bring it up during our weekly roommate meetings, but...
Hey, Nick, can I talk to you for a second?
Job, if you could just...
Oh, yeah, I'll hang out over here, read some Kant.
Did he just call me what I think he called me?
He wanted to what?
Never mind.
Oh, he said, no, to clarify. I think he said he's going to read some Kant. Not Kant. It's just that he's a Gungan, so it sounded like the C word. But he didn't say anything bad. Because he said he was reading philosophy earlier. He set that up. Does he know we're playing Catan? Like every day?
Not. Why would I tell him?
Shit, don't tell him. Because then he's
I'm not going
to want to play.
It is a little harder now because we're on this side of the house. So it's going to be like our Catan side was on the other side. We were playing under the cabinet.
I can't wait till
he's definitely going to know at this point.
Tent I ordered from Amazon gets here because then we can just hang out in the tent.
I mean, yeah, that's the ideal situation. But until then, right now, he's going to probably figure it out unless we pause Catan for a few days. Is it worth it?
No. We could play it on Oculus, I guess. All right, let's just go talk to Joe Blow. All right. Yeah. Catan would be super fun, Joe Blow. That sounds great, man.
Sounds great.
Definitely. That's awesome, man. I'm so excited. I feel like there's nothing that really gets a bunch of people together than just like a nice, competitive but friendly game. Like Catan. And you'll forget about all these problems with the line down the apartment and all of that. It'll be great. We'll be one big happy family again.
Great. Well, Joe Blow, I'm glad we finally got you on the podcast to expose the listeners to you, and appreciate you coming on.
Hey, can I just say before we finish things off here that I'm sorry I blew up earlier. It's just I care so much about both of you, and we've been through everything together. It's really crazy when you think about it. I mean, I love you guys. I love you guys, and I don't know what I would do if I was out there on my own, back on Naboo with the other Gungans, and you're my best friends.
Okay.
You're my best friends,
Thanks, Joe.
Joe Blob, I have heard that. I have heard that, and I have registered that statement, and appreciate your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for coming on, and we'll see you in a little bit. We're just gonna wrap things up how we do it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
If you would squeeze me, I'm heading back to my part of the apartment.
That's the show. Thank you, Tim Sandefur, for coming back on the program to expose us to a new and interesting author. Thank you, Nick Sperduti, for being a great space buddy. And special thanks to friend and comedian Jared Berman for coming on this week to voice Joe Blob. Until next time, tally-ho!